That was interesting. I have a very nice bowl of flour. We bought a grain mill. Let's take a look at it. This is the Komo Fidibus Classic grain mill, and it is quite a bit bigger than I actually expected. I read the measurements, so I knew how big it was, but sometimes having the item physically in your hands and in your house can still surprise you. And this surprised me quite a bit. It is beautifully made. It's so beautiful. We are going to attempt my first grind on this. So this is not a review because I haven't used it yet, so I have nothing to review other than its pure beauty. This is a first impressions video. So I'm going to share my first impressions. I've already looked inside to see how the millstones work, and now I'm going to attempt my first grind. I'm going to grind 500 grams of biodynamic wheat. Along with the grinder, I bought 2 big giant bags full of grain. And this one is wheat, and I have one identical one of rye. I'm going to use my scoop and dig out approximately 500 grams. So I'm going to use my bowl and just tare my weight. And then I'm going to get out 500 grams. I have no idea how much that is. My scoop is too big for the bag. Nothing. Let's see if a children's cup works. That worked much better. Now let's measure it out. 200 grams. 360. 400. 500 grams. Now let's try to grind it. I'm taking off the top and then I'm plucking it in, and I'm actually going to turn it on before I put the wheat inside. Uh-oh. That plan was not thought through because I need this bowl underneath there. This is hands-on learning. You are learning this alongside me. Put the scale away and then we can put the bowl underneath. I transferred the wheat to a jar so that we can just put it in. I'm going to turn the machine on before I put any wheat in it, just to make sure it doesn't hold. That's a cute little sound. Let's see what it says once the wheat is in there. That was interesting. I have a very nice bowl of flour. Using the Komo Fidibus Classic to grind the flour was a really smooth experience. It's very easy to put the grain in. It doesn't make a lot of sound before you put the grain in. It does make some sound while it's grinding the grain, but I don't find it overwhelming, and it was pretty fast. I had thought it would take a lot longer for the grinder to grind 500 grams. I did not time it. I will time it at later tries just to figure out how long it took. I can already tell you that I'm going to play a lot with this, and I think I'm going to make some mistakes along the way. First off, I actually wanted to grind this flour really fine, but I neglected to adjust the grind size after I had looked into the stones. This batch of flour is more of a medium grind, on the finer side, not completely medium, but it still looks really good. It looks like the Graham flour or all bran flour that we usually buy from the stores. So I'm pretty excited to find out just how fine the fine flour is. I also got a sift, not the cylinder sift that you can put on, but a manual sift to sift some flour, and I'm going to try that over the coming days as well. But right now I really wanted to just play with it that first time, and I wanted to show you a true experience of what it's like to try something like this for the first time. Because I think so often when we see people do things for the first time, they've done practice runs. They aren't picking out something to scoop out the grain with, realizing then that their scoop is entirely too big to fit in the bag of grains. They aren't putting the grains into the bowl they want the flour in, just to realize that they can't exactly put the grains in the mill and have the bowl underneath at the same time. This is a real honest learning experience, and this is what it's like. And you can beat yourself up for not realizing those things, but you can also just go ahead and say that's the fun of it. The fun of it is figuring out, okay, what tool do I use to make this a smooth process? What do I keep the berries in once I've measured them out? Where do I store my berries? How do I weigh my berries? Where do I do that? I can tell you for one thing, our weight is in the completely wrong spot in our kitchen. We hardly ever use it in that spot. So I'm going to think of a different place to put it. I don't know if you can tell by the bowl, but this is pretty fine flour. Maybe you can tell by my fingers. I can feel the bran in it, but I actually feel less of the bran than when we buy our Graham flour or all bran flour. So I can see some bigger chunks of bran here and there, but majority feels pretty fine. I've also been told that it's quite messy to grind your own flour, that it creates a lot of dust. And obviously I can't tell you from experience if that is true when you run it multiple times over the course of a week or anything like that. But from this first grind, I'm sorry, I'm looking at it over there. But from this first grind, I really have to say it didn't create a lot of dust. And you can probably tell as well by the bowl that I've been touching it, but there's no dust here. There's no dust, no flour dust. And I took a look at the mill and there's no dust surrounding the nozzle. There's dust inside the nozzle, obviously, because the flour comes out there, so there's still flour left. If you wanted to, you can probably clean that out, but if you're going to use it regularly, you probably don't have to, unless you're concerned about contamination. I've also heard that freshly ground flour is difficult to bake with. It's difficult to get the same rise. For some people, it's difficult to process. I'm not sure if that will be an issue for us, because we are used to eating a lot of fiber in our diet. So I'm not too concerned, but I will obviously be on the lookout for it. So now that I've done my first grind, I'm going to try an overnight loaf that I usually make with wheat and see how it turns out. Just experiment. Part of the exciting process of adding a new tool, a new skill, and building out our food storage like this, because having wheat and rye on hand in such quantities is going to do wonders for our food storage. But the exciting part is that now the refining starts. Now I get to play with the mill and with the flour I create, I get to try different combinations. I am going to take some of this flour and start a new sourdough with it because my sourdough sadly passed away. Yeah, it grew mold, like really bad. I used to bake a lot with sourdough when I was younger and we lived in a different place. But when we moved to the apartment we lived in for many years before we bought this house, that was a very damp place and not a very healthy place. And while we did everything we possibly could to remedy that, it was still pretty damp and everything grew mold. So that is part of our story. We couldn't keep a potted plant without the dirt growing mold. We couldn't keep a sourdough without growing mold. And now that we have this grain mill and we have this amazing flour, this is like gold for sourdough in my opinion, because this is freshly ground. You have all the yeast and all the things living on the grain. It's right here, it's still alive. It hasn't been warmed up. It does warm a little bit when you grind the flour, but you need to go a bit above 40 degrees Celsius to kill the yeast, and this definitely hasn't been that hot. So it's all alive still in here, and we're going to start a sourdough and we're going to put the rest of this flour into a yeast loaf, and I'm going to experiment with this. I'm going to experiment with my process for grinding the flour and how much and how often. I'm not sure if we should grind a bit to keep in the fridge for making sauces and such when you make a roux, but right now I'm excited to get the sourdough started, so let's do that. The lighting is odd. I'm not going to complain about sunlight. We just have to deal with it. The easiest way, in my opinion, to start a sourdough is to take 1 part flour and 1 part water. You can keep it to just those 2 ingredients. You can also, if you want to speed up the process, put a tiny bit of yeast in there, or you can put something like honey in there. Yeah, I'm not going to use the yeast. I am going to rely on the natural yeast, but I am going to give it a little bit of honey because I think it adds to the complexity of the flavor. So I have this glass that we just used for the wheat berries, and instead of taking a new one or having to wash this one, we're just going to use this one. When I use sourdough, I use a decent amount. So I'm going to, this is, how much does this fit? It does not say. Can you tell? It doesn't say. So we have to guess. 500, 600 milliliter, 700, 750? Might be 750. And we're also going to reuse our handy dandy children's cup. So I'm just going to take some flour and we are going to measure out 150 grams. Now I'm going to add 150 grams of water. The final ingredient is going to be a little bit of honey. If I can get the honey jar open. I have this tiny amount of leftover honey. Should have used a bigger spoon. I'm going to remove the scale, put that one off to the side, and then I'm going to stir it a bit. To get the honey off the spoon and get it all mixed inside. I'm going to push it all down. I think that should be pretty well. Then I'm going to not put a lid on it, but put a cloth on it. I grabbed 2 elastics and I'm going to use this red one to place at the level of the sourdough. So the current level. This will help me see how much the sourdough has risen. Then I am going to place my cloth over top so that it can breathe, but it won't get any nasty animals in there. And I'm just going to set this on the kitchen counter, and tomorrow I will feed it again. Once I have more experience using the grain mill, I will absolutely get back to you with a review, and I'll probably share some of my favorite recipes along the way. Here are the first 2 things I'm trying out. It's a very simple recipe. I use 3 cups of flour, 1.5 cup of water, 3/4 of a teaspoon of yeast, and a good amount of salt. I don't have it measured. I just pour in the amount I know is kind of right for our family, but it's probably more than you expect. That is going to rise. I typically put it in the fridge overnight, but since this is pretty early in the day, I'm going to let it rise outside of the fridge and I'm going to bake it tonight, and we will have it with dinner. I also just want to show you this. The sourdough is already bubbling and it hasn't been very long. It isn't bubbling on top yet, but it's already starting to form small pockets of air inside of it. So I think, fingers crossed, this may be a really good sourdough in a week's time. And that's all for this video. If you enjoyed watching this new addition to our kitchen and our food storage, I really hope that you will subscribe and share this video with someone else. And thank you for joining us on our journey from home to homestead.